Hello and welcome to our Enterprise Kubernetes panel. I'm your host, Mike Vizar. Today we'll be talking about all things related to deploying and managing Kubernetes environments within the enterprise. Before I introduce our guests, there's a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to get to. The first is draw your attention to the Q&A button on your screen. So as we go along and you have a question, we encourage you to share that with us and we'll answer that as we're going along. And then secondarily, we're going to have 4 Amazon gift cards today for people for the raffle. So you got to stay to the end. You got to be present to win, all that good stuff. But hang in there, folks, because we're going to have a panel here that's going to help you in your future career, in addition to giving you a chance to get some last-minute Christmas gifts from our friends over at Amazon. Our speakers today are Andy Soderman, who is Director of R&D Technology for Fairwinds, a provider of managed services. Andy, welcome.
Thank you.
We also have Wojciech Kozin, who's software engineer for Influx Data, a provider of a time series database platform. Wojciech, how are you doing?
Thank you. Hello, I'm good.
And then finally, we have Prashantu Kachavera, Director of Product for Kubernetes at Trilio, a provider of a data protection platform. All right, guys, welcome to the show. Andy, let's get started with Kubernetes in the enterprise. It's a slightly different beast than it is when you're, say, a startup company or a software company where you have a lot of DevOps engineers in the Kubernetes in the enterprise. You may have some folks who are DevOps specialists and they know how to use a CLI. Other folks are mere mortals. They just have IT administration skills. They're used to working with a GUI. Do you think that as Kubernetes and the processes come together, that this is starting to feel more like a team sport and organizations need to have multiple ways of managing Kubernetes, or is everybody going to become an SRE someday?
That's a great question. I think at this point in time, it's still really all over the board. I think I've seen things in, lots of different formats. I do think that what everybody wants is Kubernetes as a platform internally, not just Kubernetes, but the platform built on top of it that enables their developers. And I think companies are starting to move in that direction. It's really across the board. I've seen shops that have, 300 developer clusters, one per team, and they're all running their own miniature dev cluster, and then they throw it over the wall to the DevOps team that's managing their cluster with Terraform. I've seen shops that have 600 node clusters and 30 teams deploying into that single cluster for both staging and production. And so it really is kind of the Wild West out there in regards to that.
All right. Wojciech, let me ask you the same question with a slightly different spin on it. Do you think also that even a DevOps engineer, one morning they might want to use a CLI and the next day they want to do a GUI, and it just kind of depends on the task at hand and what needs to be done and which one is more convenient, right?
Yes, I have to. First of all, I have to agree with Andy that I think in a lot of aspects it's really Wild West and it's really a lot of people doing different things. And I think because of that, it's also more useful to be using a CLI and being down into the guts of technology and using a UI or using a text-based UI some other days. So for example, when you're trying to debug some things and just try to figure out what's happening, I think a good UI like K9S, for example, which is a CLI tool, but it's a UI in itself, is basically making it faster for me to switch between different types of Kubernetes objects and just trying to figure out step by step where the issue may be happening or what's happening, that things are slowing down, breaking, or any other thing that's happening. And on the other side, if I want to focus on doing something so later down the road I could automate it, I'm going to go with the CLI or maybe even just writing YAML or even using tools to generate YAML, but basically go down with the tools that will later on help me automate the process. So that whatever I run now, 15 minutes later, I can turn it into some sort of automation that could be used by others. And that could be templatized or any other things that need to be done so that not just our team could use it, but other teams, other people and could run. So it really depends on whether this is a one-off or this is something you want to automate. And it also depends on who gives you a good UI. So we're dealing a lot with data as a time series database. And sometimes you can see a lot of data outside of Kubernetes. So like going to the Cloud Console and seeing the disk usage patterns and trying to analyze that. So there's really no reason to just try to stick with Kubernetes. or just try to stick with CLIs when you can see something. But if you're doing something in the context of later automating it, it makes more sense to just try to use whatever tools you can later use to automate it.
Prashanto, are you seeing the same thing? Is there like a separation in tasks where, let's say I am doing backup and recovery, since this is a space that you guys know, and I could just do that with a GUI, maybe even simpler than I can with a CLI when I'm trying to wrap that into a whole extended process? Or do you see customers doing both depending on what their personal preferences are?
I would say it's a mixture of both. So, firstly, I would say there is a strong dependence, what we see on CLI as well as the UI. Uh, CLI is more from the delivery of the application that we see, and then UI is more from the observability front. So what we see is developers want to use at least on the backup side, developers want to use the CLI from a deployment perspective, making sure that the application is protected right from the get-go. And then once it is deployed, they want to use the UI to manage and monitor it. And this is from the dev perspective, to the point that you were saying that everything is a team sport now. So that's the developer realm. When we look at the IT admin persona, they are completely, or not completely, but mainly based on the UI itself, because they are now looking at the entire cluster at a holistic level and managing the same namespaces which the developers are also working on, but they're looking at a much more macro level than the dev folks. So I would say that what the way we look at it is the CLI is very important, because as which had mentioned, that we need to have automation, and that's going to happen through the CLI. But then once you have things running from an observability monitoring perspective, the UI becomes more important.
All right, so it's definitely evolving into something that feels like a team sport. Andy, let me ask you this. We've been at this DevOps thing now for, I don't know, more than a decade, let's say that. Kubernetes has been around for 6 years or so, but it's really just going mainstream now in the enterprise. I think that's a fair assessment. Do you think, though, that as more people adopt Kubernetes and these tools and these frameworks, that they will either embrace DevOps workflows more aggressively, or maybe expand the ones they have out more broadly than they have in the past? And will Kubernetes kind of force a conversation about how IT actually gets managed in these environments?
Yes, I definitely think it will be a forcing function. I've seen it in small and large companies where Kubernetes, due to on the bad side of it, the sheer complexity of it sort of forces developers to become familiar with the environment that they're operating in, which on the side of DevOps can be seen as a good thing. And so I definitely think that Kubernetes will continue to be at the center of that, and it will continue to be part of the DevOps workflow and force enterprises to adopt that.
All right. We hear a lot about GitOps. Now, some people say, GitOps is an opinionated form of DevOps. Other people are more cynical. They're basically, you took the infrastructure as code software, you stuck it in a repository alongside the other artifacts we have and called it something different. Okay, that's great, whatever. But do you think that we are moving to this world where the convergence of the infrastructure and the application is all being pushed together or melded together in a way that requires people to rethink how they actually go about doing these workflows and creating that? And what's the challenges in trying to do that?
Right. So I think that, as Andy said, there's way more complexity, especially with Kubernetes, but also just with the level of cloud services that are available and the ways in which they should be managed. And it kind of goes back to the UI versus automation. Now with services with applications using multiple services, that some of them be cloud managed like databases, some of them being inside Kubernetes, like all of the microservices that the application is composed of, it just increases the complexity to a level that not having automation and also some sort of auditability and a way of properly managing this and syncing the state of the application between teams, maybe with some additional testing before this goes all the way to production, is starting to become a requirement. So, for example, I remember many years ago, there will be applications that are just simple WAR files that will be deployed on an application server, and that's all that had to happen. And then there was less automation involved in doing that. Whereas these days we have multiple databases, multiple instances of applications, and then each application is composed of dozens, if not hundreds, of microservices, and they all need to be defined somewhere. And it's really difficult to keep maintaining this without GitOps. So I think this just becomes a must-have when we switch to this paradigm of building microservices. And even if someone is just trying to move to Kubernetes and they're moving by doing lift and shift of the monolithic application and trying to extract it later on, you still want to be at least embracing part of GitOps, because you will want to use the same flow for whatever you're going to be separating into the microservices or migrating into this newer approach you may be trying to do, even if you previously had just one monolithic application that you originally deployed. So I think it's very important, because the complexity enforces this, and otherwise it's not possible to manage the infrastructure anymore.
All right, Prashanta, do you agree? Do you think that Kubernetes and GitOps are essentially going to be joined at the hip?
Yeah, so if we think about architectures, right? We had bare metal architectures, we had virtualization architectures, and now we are in the Kubernetes space. Bare metal to virtualization, the architecture was pretty much standard. It's just that you were getting better efficiencies on the platform. Now, when you go into Kubernetes, it's like everything is broken down into millions of objects, right? And managing these millions and hundreds of thousands of objects, it's going to be manually very difficult to do so. So automation is definitely required, and that automation through GitOps is one way of achieving that. Right, GitOps is absolutely great because you are defining everything as infrastructure as code, and then all of that gets played into your cluster. Where and overall the automation of that aspect is great because you have that centralized repository where everything is stored, and then you have better control over all the versions and the changes that you're making over and over again. There are obviously challenges to that. For example, from a troubleshooting aspect, right? GitOps mentality says that you should not touch the cluster directly. You should go through a merge request or a pull request to make that change. And when you're troubleshooting and things are going wrong, you may not want to do that long process, and you will directly go into the cluster and start changing things. So there are certain challenges over there, which I think the GitOps philosophy will eventually address. I can easily visualize something where someone is going and touching a cluster, and automatically a PR is created based on those activities when the user says, "Hey, I'm done." So automation is definitely there. GitOps is awesome, and I believe it is here to stay. And there are certain challenges which I believe will be addressed in the near future as well.
Well, I'm shocked to discover that something could go wrong in the land of IT, but okay, I'm with it. Andy, I think it's a bit of a chicken and an egg kind of situation right there. I think a lot of people come to Kubernetes and they look at it and they're intimidated, and some of them run away screaming because they're like, this just can't be. I can't cope with that. What do you think is the level of automation that we're going to see today versus tomorrow, and what should people really be thinking about? Because I wonder if there's a lot of low-level stuff that people are being asked to do in Kubernetes today that tomorrow is just going to be automated.
I really hope that becomes the case. I really hope we see more and more reasonable defaults and automation around how you deploy into your clusters. I think we've seen indications of this in the market. I think GKE Autopilot is a step in the right direction of that. I think a lot of the things that we see around admission control, mutating and validating both, will provide a lot safer way to run a Kubernetes cluster and a lot more reliable way to run it out of the box. We always say Kubernetes is extremely powerful and it can do anything you want, but that brings with it danger in and of itself. So if we can automate away a lot of those different pieces that are, industry standard things that we do everywhere, it'll be great to see that happen in the market.
Wojciech, one of the things about automation is you kind of have to decide what your architecture is going to be. Sometimes I talk to folks, especially the early adopters, and they're running a handful of large Kubernetes clusters, and they're trying to share that across a bunch of apps. In the enterprise, however, it feels like, not everybody plays nice. They all have different budgets and they have different application owners, and everybody wants their own little cluster. And now, we're even going to push stuff out to the edge, and we might have these fleets of Kubernetes clusters. So is there some way to think about the management of Kubernetes at scale in the enterprise? And is everybody going to be forced to a lot of little small clusters, or is there a role for both a big cluster architecture and a fleet of smaller Kubernetes clusters?
I think it depends on the use case, really. I believe that one of the problem that Andy also pointed out is like when you start to run things with Kubernetes, you get overwhelmed by how many things you need to set up. So Kubernetes on its own is great, but then there are so many things you need to install on top of it to be able to do anything meaningful, like an ingress, cert manager, Istio, like some tools like Prometheus or other tools for monitoring. Some system for alerting, then you have some systems for deploying, so for your GitOps. There's a lot of things that need to be set up for every single environment. So the bootstrapping of an environment is the pain point. I think that's going to get simpler over time. I think it is much simpler than what it used to be, and things are more stable. So compared to 2 or 3 years ago, less things break, or there are less breaking changes than what I remember. There are still things like if you move to the stable ingress, you need to change some things. If you move between other types of objects, some things will break, or like when you're using Vault and you upgrade to Kubernetes 121, you will get surprised by some of the issues with authentication. But I think there is much less of that than what it used to be, and because of that, and because things being more stable, it is now possible to define a company standard or a team standard or some organization standard across what gets deployed into a cluster and all of the software for managing the cluster. So creating multiple clusters becomes easier. For example, what we do at Influx is we have our own set of common components, and we can pick and choose from them, but usually that would be the whole set of those components. And this makes it easy for us to deploy multiple clusters and to just have the same setup, and also use some of the non-production clusters for testing some of the updates, or for things like doing CD based on GitOps. We have a set of clusters where we can run a newer version of the CD software that we have, and we can test that things work there for a few weeks before we decide to upgrade it in all the other environments. So I think we're at the point now where it's still difficult because there's so many software, there's a lot of software that needs to be deployed. But I think the stability is much greater these days. So it is possible to capture that in an automation. It's just that it's still some upfront investment that the companies need to make, or that they need to figure out what they need to do. And I'm kind of hoping that some companies will try to solve it. Like Google is now giving an option to install Istio, or I believe they also give the option to install an ingress by default. And I suspect that many cloud vendors will just default to a lot of the components that people will need, and maybe they'll also ship built-in integration with their DNS servers for certificate management and all the things that most of the companies have to deal with today. I'm hoping that a lot of that gets automated at least by the cloud vendors.
Prashantho, it's not clear to me who is the biggest proponent for Kubernetes in the enterprise these days. I mean, is it the IT operations people, or is it the developers? I talked to the IT ops people, and they like the idea of being able to scale resources up and down using the orchestration engine, and there's an efficiency there once you master it. I talked to developers, and they're not always as keen about Kubernetes, and a lot of them are kind of like building container applications, and if they never saw Kubernetes, they'd be just as happy. So from your perspective, who's leading this conversation?
So if you think about when newer technology comes in, it's generally, at least from our space, we see the dev aspect, or the developers trying to adopt newer technologies faster, and then it kind of proliferates onto the IT side. Here I feel couple of things. Definitely, I have seen the dev space, adopting Kubernetes, already running Kubernetes clusters, whether it's internally or in the cloud. That's one aspect of it. The IT space, basically tends to provide the infrastructure what the developers want to do to build and deliver the applications faster. And if you think about Kubernetes, the overarching principle is software development and software delivery, right? So from that angle, definitely we think that the dev space is leading the baton. Obviously, it's not 100%. On the other side, because of the power of Kubernetes, we see infrastructures also adopting that and changing their own architecture and backplane to Kubernetes. For example, if you think about vSphere, vSphere now is basically architected on a Kubernetes backplane as well. So there's a natural function from tools and things that you use that will also be pushing you into that Kubernetes space. So one is internally, to do things innovatively, where you will see that push, and then the other one is a more organic, pull from the ISVs and things that you deal with.
All right, I think I'm going to paraphrase that a little bit. I think what you said is that some subset of the developer community decides to go after Kubernetes and they bring it into the organization. About a couple of months later, they figure out they bit off more than they can chew and they go running over to IT Ops for some help. And then IT Ops says, this is great. And then they try to enforce that down to the rest of the developers who go, what the heck is this?
Yeah.
All right. That's a good cycle. Andy, let me ask you something about how much should people really be interacting with Kubernetes? Because one of the things you hear all the time is that it is a platform for building platforms. And if that is the case, then maybe we should be just interacting at a higher level of abstraction. There's a lot of offerings out there, I think, where you can provision a CI/CD platform and it will just automatically provision Kubernetes clusters underneath it. So do you think that maybe we are getting a little too deep in the woods here and there is another way to think about it?
Oh, that's such a tricky question, especially having been a managed Kubernetes provider for so many years. I think there's no easy answer to that question. I don't think there's enough flexibility in a lot of the out-of-the-box managed Kubernetes systems out there that are built on top of others to give enterprises the level of control that they usually want over the environment. And so I really feel like people, at least at the enterprise level, who have dedicated ops teams that have the space and time to build platforms on top of Kubernetes should be doing that. Comes back to your question of architecture as well. Like, I think coming into a Kubernetes migration with a well-architected plan for how we're going to build these clusters, how we're going to enable our developers on these clusters, can make for a very positive experience moving into Kubernetes. But it does require a significant amount of effort and planning up front. And I don't see any currently in the market managed services out there that really provide that level of architecture tailored to individual needs.
All right. So you basically have to adjust to the managed service essentially versus having the platform kind of adjust to the way you want to run it or use it. And you have to make a decision about that. It's not an all or nothing. Sometimes you can easily adopt and you're good enough to go, right? I mean, it's a balance.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Let me ask you this. We talked about automation, and I don't think you can throw the proverbial cat these days without hitting somebody talking about AI. Do you think that artificial intelligence will come and help save us all a little bit as we move forward with Kubernetes and automation, and that there is a way to start thinking about this, where at least augmenting the current IT staff in some way? I don't think we're ever going to replace anybody, but can we make this simpler?
I don't know if this would be AI specifically. I believe that there will be some applications where it makes sense. I think it kind of goes back to making it a bit simpler for automation in general. With having multiple microservices and having a lot of the smaller components of the applications running in Kubernetes makes it more difficult to manage everything manually. And I believe that things like setting all the resource requests and limits and all the things at the microservice level, it's really difficult to manage that manually. So I would be expecting some tool or tools to just gather this data over time, which is obviously a time series database would be handy. But in general, tools that would gather this data, and then be able to suggest optimizations or maybe even apply them. I think that AI ML would fit in there quite well, but I kind of see the pattern in which just getting past data would, or maybe current data, like for example, queue sizes, and that's some of that is already available. So basically getting some of the past data or current data and trying to figure out how to scale up, down, what could be tweaked to better for the application to be running more smoothly in Kubernetes. I think a lot of that could still be done. Um, I suspect the AML would be a reasonable candidate for that, just because we would have a lot of data and we would be able to gather this data over time. So yes, I can see this. I can totally see this happening. Like I said, I think there's a lot of data that could be gathered and is gathered by many organizations. So just making use of the data, whether that's someone trying to make sense out of it using some basic data analysis or using AIML to better automate that, that would make a lot of sense. And then using that, there's also a lot of tools and technologies that allow doing that. So for example, there's a lot of development around auto scaling, and there's Keda, which allows defining scalars to define whether things should be scaled up and down. Like I said, one of the options is checking the queue size for things that are basically data processing, and that example doesn't require AI ML, and it's something people could be doing today. I think in a lot of cases it's just a matter of prioritization, whether it makes sense to just try to tweak it manually versus spend the time upfront on fully automating this. And I think companies just progressively get to the point where more of the optimizations happen automatically. But I think in general, automation of deployed resources and either optimizing for less resource utilization or for the application performance or both is going to be important, and is starting to be important already.
Right. Prashanta, you talked about observability earlier. And in my mind, this conversation with AI and observability are kind of linked, because to make the AI work, I need to be able to collect a lot of data. I need to be able to find the metrics and the traces and instrument stuff and the whole 9 yards. What is your feeling about the state of observability in the Kubernetes world as we know it today? Because, we talk about Prometheus as a monitoring platform, but I'm not sure that we're observing anything these days, as much as we're still just gathering a bunch of metrics that we're looking at but don't have any context for.
Correct. I think, yes, observability is a big topic, and definitely machine learning is aligned with that topic very well, because collecting metrics is one thing, but providing an inference between metrics collected from one data source to another data source to a third data source is the more valuable thing that people are looking for, right? For example, hey, I'm having a resource crunch over here at this pod level. How is that affecting my application, which is running on so and so node and serving X number of customers? That connection, definitely needs to happen more, and I think that is the level at which observability tools need to start diving deeper to make monitoring and life simpler within a Kubernetes system. Because again, you have so many different objects. Memory issue on one of the pods, how does that reflect into your overall IT environment and your overall business and your SLAs and things? That entire full picture needs to be drawn out, and that needs to be provided back to the developers and to the admins from an observability perspective. I think most of the tools are getting there. Additional data connections and pattern recognitions and things are happening. So the system and whatever is built within the Kubernetes system will get simpler, and these train of thoughts and these line of connections will happen more and more as we move in the future.
All right. Andy, do you want to add to that? Because there's a lot of people who are skeptical of the whole term observability, and they're like, this is just the latest thing from monitoring platforms to get me to upgrade. Or is observability a real thing, and will Kubernetes force the issue?
I think observability is totally a thing, and I totally agree with everything Prashanto said about being able to collect those metrics and then make correlations. I've seen a lot of really good improvements from various products out there, I think, as you mentioned, that have been starting to do this. I've been surprised lately logging into Datadog and just seeing some of the things that it's throwing at me, and I'm like, oh, I would not have made that connection myself, and that's really interesting to see them starting to do that. So I think it's incredibly important, especially as your cluster gets larger and you're deploying more and more things. It's going to be impossible to just look at the metrics and make those correlations ourselves, because that's what we've always done as ops engineers: is gone and looked at the graphs and used our intuition and historical experience to make those connections. But we can't expect everybody to be able to do that, and we're going to have some tool to make that easier for them. So.
Right. Well, speaking of tools, back in the bad old days, there used to be something of a metric that said, the average IT administrator could manage, I don't know, I'll make up a number, 50 servers or something. It didn't really matter. Today, as we go forward, we're shorthanded on talent as it is, and we have all these clusters out there. Is there some sort of average number of clusters that an administrator should be managing, or is that metric gone by the wayside and we need to think differently about, how do we know whether we're staffed properly or not?
I don't think that metric applies anymore. So it also depends on how related the workloads are. As an example, I can think of workload that's just deployed across 20 Kubernetes clusters across multiple cloud vendors, across multiple regions, but serving a very similar application. And at that point, the number of people that need to manage that set of Kubernetes clusters would be completely different than, say, 10 clusters, each of them running completely different type of an application, because their understanding of what's happening and what the potential issues might be, and even having knowledge of all the run books and all the automation that could be run against it, or where all the metrics, where all the logs are, they would be so much different if the applications differ much more than what happens if this is the same application or similar application just running in multiple systems. I don't really know if there is a way to define it. I mean, we could potentially think about, is there a metric like in the number of components and or microservices an application is composed of, and then trying to scale it out. But as I said, I think a lot of it depends on differences. So if the application is written in one language, if the logging scheme is the same, that may also matter. For example, I've seen application where most of the code would be in Golang, and I've seen application where this part would be in Ruby on Rails, this part would be Node.js, and this part would be Rust, this part would be Golang, and this part would be something else entirely. And then managing that and being able to even manage the lifecycle of that is much more complex than an application that's using the same tech stack. So that really varies, and I think we need to figure out a way to measure that, but I don't really know what that could be at this point.
Anybody have any thoughts on measurements or how many people I should be using? Andy, you're a managed service provider. What do you guys do?
We've tried different things over time, number of clusters, number of services, number of nodes, and none of them really work. I think it comes down to the level of automation that you have and the number of, and how well you're enabling your development teams. Because if you have a fully automated or a well-automated cluster management system and you've built in automation for your developer enablement and you've provided guardrails and a good environment for them to deploy into, then one ops person can support 30 development teams deploying into 20 clusters, right? So it really comes down to how well you're enabling your developers and the level of automation that you have. So that's not a metric, and I know I kind of dodged the question there, but I think those are the determining factors rather than any sort of number or metric.
All right, I think these guys are saying as much as you can possibly handle, and then when your head explodes, that's too many, right? All right. Prashant, we've been talking a lot about Kubernetes, but I'd love to get your opinion on this. Once I get Kubernetes up and running, it turns around now, I've got to like roll out Prometheus and half a dozen other products and open source projects. And suddenly the stack is more complex than the cluster itself. So do you think people are thinking through or prepared for the entire stack and the ecosystem of things that I need to deploy on Kubernetes and how to manage all that? Or do we need to think through that as well?
I think where people are in their journey, they're not really thinking about, like, I'm not talking about providers, but from end customers and end users. Folks are really not thinking about the overall ecosystem aspect around Kubernetes in terms of, again, monitoring, logging, and things like that. And that needs to become simpler and needs to be, folks need to be provided a choice as well. Now, how you do that, again, is that through automation or is that through professional services? I think professional services probably is the immediate need where you can educate and tell people exactly what's needed. But I think professional services eventually will turn into a lot more automation, where it would be like, hey, this is your hardened cluster with XYZ, you can go deploy that. Or this is your hardened cluster with ABC, and you can go deploy that. So I think definitely not thinking about it today. It is back of mind, because of which you end up bringing in professional services. And then when the user base around that understands, okay, the value of the professional services, they start automating most of it. And I think, as Andy said, from a managed service provider, a lot of the automation and management around these bootstrapping pieces are already done for the same reason.
Andy, do I really want a managed Kubernetes service, or do I want you to show up and give me like a managed DevOps experience that happens to run on Kubernetes and kind of run the whole thing soup to nuts?
I don't think you want either. I think you want, like Prashanto said, professional services in the form of a high-level architecture advice to come in and help you build your platform on Kubernetes and build it in such a way that you can maintain it with your own team going forward.
All right. Wojciech, you're an engineer. What do you think of the advice you get from professional services people these days? And, are you inclined to take it, or is it more like just one more opinion?
Well, I think it depends. I think it depends on the level of expertise the company has internally. So I've been at companies that have had a lot of experience internally, and I think this would just be one more opinion. But I've also seen companies that are just beginning their journey with Kubernetes, and then I think they would really value the professional services opinion, especially that not all applications are the same, and deploying or migrating or plans for moving into Kubernetes really vary between each and every company. And if someone doesn't have the Kubernetes knowledge and experience today, and they don't have staff that could make those decisions themselves, it really is important to have someone that guides you through the beginning of the process and helps you move in the right direction. Because I've also seen people that just try to do lift and shift into cloud native approach, and that either means running Kubernetes that manages VMs using KubeVirt or with VMware solution or anything like that, where it's not really Kubernetes at that point, or just moving an application to a container without properly thinking on how to ensure that it's highly available, that there is an upgrade path that doesn't cause downtime, and that it's manageable in the long run. So if you have the experience, it would probably be just one more opinion. If you don't, this would be something that would be really valuable to the company, and it would make much more sense to start with that if you don't have the experience in-house.
Andy, as you think this through a little bit, are organizations going to think more now about, we hear about digital transformation all the time, and are you seeing organizations decide that they just want to write business logic in the software and they don't really want to be involved in managing the infrastructure anymore? And I'm asking this because historically, I think 20% of IT might have been consumed as a service, but is that going to be 50% or more as we move along? What do you think?
It's hard to say because my perspective is a little bit biased, because the people who come to us are asking us to help them build it instead of asking us to run it for them. Usually, I mean, the enterprises that come to us want us to help them build it. And so I feel like I'm seeing more, we want to manage it, but we want help doing it. Again, I may be slightly biased just based on the types of people that come to us for that conversation, but I would say managing internally seems to be more the trend.
Oh, cool. All right. With that in mind, I'm going to ask you each this question because a lot of our folks are either just getting started or a little bit down the path. And so, Prashanta, what is your best advice to folks who I think there's very few greenfield environments in the enterprise, right? Everybody's got legacy stuff. They've got legacy DevOps processes they've been using for monolithic stuff. So how do I introduce something like Kubernetes into that environment? What's your best advice to go about doing that?
I would say if you're just starting out with Kubernetes, coming from a different background, definitely understand the architecture and understand how that is going to serve your business needs first, and then understand, as Wojciech mentioned, how your application needs to be modernized or reconstructed, re-architected to take the best advantage of Kubernetes. There have been several scenarios, as when people go to lift and shift things, and the expectation does not match reality, and that is where you get distraught over, hey, why did I invest so much time and things into it? So definitely understand what the Kubernetes architecture is going to provide for your business model and your applications, and then tune it accordingly to have that reality addressed or realized.
All right. Wojciech, what do you think? Is there some secret sauce somewhere that you can share with people about how to go about doing this? Or is it just, dive in the deep end of the pool and hope for the best?
Well, I mean, I would say there is no secret sauce. I think there are some attempts, and some of them are good, some of them are worse. I think lift and shift may also be a good idea in some cases, but it's not really the best idea in a lot of them, because it makes moving into a different architecture with different mindset when it was built, makes it more difficult to build applications, to run applications that were built with something else in mind. I think it all depends on the application. It all depends on how well it could be, modernized or re-architected. I mean, there are some approaches to this. So there's the middle ground between re-architecting and lift and shifting, which is where we try to take out some of the pieces and try to make them more modernized. So, for example, if there's a small bit of the application responsible for authentication, and then it uses JWT or any other piece that could be taken out, that could be one of the interesting starting points, because usually authentication is somewhat separate, and it should be easy to take out of the system. But again, it really depends on the application. There's no secret sauce. It's all the way from let's make a V2 of our application, and then that taking a lot of time to have the feature parity with the version 1, and then there's the lift and shift, which is also not really the best way for a lot of applications. I think there's a path for each application. There's a way to get to it, like with enough people in-house or professional services, as we mentioned, having the experience. There's a way to find it, there's a way to discuss it, but there's no secret sauce, there's no silver bullet, there's no answer that's going to be universal for everybody.
All right, Andy, let's flip that question a little bit. Since you've seen a lot of implementations, what do you see as a consistent thing that people are doing wrong that you wish they would know about before they went down that path?
It's a good question. My head always goes to little technical things, but from a larger perspective and an architecture perspective, I think the mistake that a lot of people make when making big decisions like this to do a digital transformation is not asking the question, why are we doing this, and what business need is it serving? Because maybe you do have an existing DevOps process that works, and you're deploying VMs, and your business is working just fine, and there's no need to do a digital transformation. That's entirely a viable answer. I know I'm the Kubernetes guy here saying maybe you shouldn't run Kubernetes, but That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying stop and ask yourself, what business goal does this align to? Is it going to help us deploy faster? Is it going to help us be more resilient? Is it going to help us scale? And agreeing with Prashanto, like have a plan for how that's going to help you get there and understand the architecture that's going to solve those problems.
All right. Moshe, let me ask you this question. What do you know now about Kubernetes and DevOps and everything that you wish you knew when you were starting out? What would it, if you were talking to yourself for 3 years ago, 4 years ago, what would you tell yourself?
Well, I would say I would tell myself to focus more on the cloud native and the 12 factors, and that basically change my mindset. So one of the things that I could have done better long time ago would be to stop thinking in the way that applications used to be developed when they were not aiming at Kubernetes. So for example, your typical Ruby on Rails application would conflate a lot of things, and that thing kind of might stay in someone's mindset. And then moving away from that into why microservices matter and why thinking that each piece could be written in a different language, could be using different technologies, and they should all just work together, and how to distinguish between stateful, stateless parts of the system. Like, I think a lot of people, including myself, started out by just trying to do something. And usually there was also a company goal to do something, and it didn't always align. Didn't always align with what the company's goal should be. It was just like, let's do something in Kubernetes, or like let's switch to microservices because that's the trend now. And then not everything I was doing early on was really as far out as it could be in terms of like being truly cloud native in the way of handling the state, handling the scalability, handling how applications run in Kubernetes. So learn the ecosystem before running production, before writing code that gets all the way to production, is what I would advise.
All right, because sometimes we think IT is a fashion industry and we just do stuff because we think it's cool and we don't really think it all the way through. Prashanto, what do you know now that you wish you knew 2 or 3 years ago?
I would say that everything in Kubernetes is happening so fast that every time I wish that, okay, I wish I had known this earlier. But completely agree with Wojciech. The ecosystem is broad. Understand what is in the ecosystem, what are the different tools available to use that is going to help your journey, whether it is developing applications on top of Kubernetes or whether just adopting it as an orchestrator. That's one. The second piece is around the extensibility of the platform. Understanding how it can be extended to tune your own needs, because not one size fits all every time. And having those two things in mind, and having a good grasp over the ecosystem and the extensibility, you will probably get a better idea of what you want to do and how you want to do it within the Kubernetes realm.
All right. Let's shift another gear with a slightly different perspective on it. But Andy, you have been named king for the day in the land of Kubernetes. What is it? What is the one thing that you would like to see fixed or changed by decree?
More secure and reliable defaults. So defaulting to requiring security policies and resource requests and limits, and having the ability to enforce that more easily and turned on by default from the beginning. Most of the reliability and security issues we see are due to misconfiguration, and they can be easily solved. And if the platform started that way by default, we might not. It might not be as difficult. Although then I might be out of a job. So
I am again shocked and appalled to discover that security is an afterthought, but here we go. Wojciech, you're a king for the day. What do you want to do? What would you change?
I would make it so that the investment upfront into running Kubernetes in production would be much smaller. So, well, maybe not bundle more things with Kubernetes, but let's say make some sort of ready-to-use sets of packages that you can just get running. So when you go to any provider that that offers managed Kubernetes, you would have the same set of components that you can pick from. They get automatically deployed by the provider, and they get updates. They get well, basically everything gets all of the updates and all of the automation. So as someone that wants to deploy software on top of Kubernetes, I just worry about my software. I don't worry about Istio, Set Manager, Ingress, monitoring platforms, logging, and all the other things. And well, CI/CD as well, probably, but to some extent, because in a lot of cases, I want to customize that. But I have the option of choosing as much as possible, so I can just merge my code in and it gets all the way to production.
All right, Prashanto, it's your turn. You're now king for the day. What are you going to fix?
I would make sure that any kind of integration with the hyperscalers is default. Everyone, we all live in a hybrid multi-cloud world, and having if Kubernetes provided these integration points into all the things that you're doing in these hyperscaler data centers right from the get-go, it would help. I would say a multitude of or a good percentage of the market to get onboarded and do things much more quickly. I know there are projects, cross-plane and stuff, which are kind of, streamlining that and bringing that into Kubernetes. I think, having that as a default get-go 0 P0 kind of an item within the Kubernetes system would be pretty useful.
All right. Guys, do you think that we are going to, start with Andy, get to this kind of hybrid cloud nirvana that people talk about? Or is it still going to be this kind of multiple clouds, but they're all managed in isolation from each other? And, we're not going to be bouncing workloads around per se. We are just going to pick a platform because it does something different than somebody else, but the data gravity issues are too big, and we're just going to wind up multiple clouds, and each one will be managed in isolation. What do you say, Andy?
Oh, you're asking the tough questions. I don't think there will be a multi-cloud nirvana. I don't think there's enough incentive for, well, really anywhere, but for the cloud providers to enable that, for someone to build a product that does that and be extremely successful. It's just, I don't think the incentives are there for that to become the norm.
Wojciech, what do you think? Possible, desirable, or just plain fanciful thinking?
I think it's desirable. I don't really know if it's possible. There are so many factors at play, and also a lot of cloud vendors want to develop their own services. They're compatible to some extent, but they're not entirely the same. So when we take a look at the simplest thing as serverless, it's basically different unless you use some framework to abstract on top of it. You would end up with that. We would end up with creating sort of per platform solutions. That's the first thing you need to build, and then build your actual business logic. I think it's easier to connect multiple clouds with multiple networking technologies, and basically it is simpler than what it used to be a few years ago when you wanted to run services between clouds. And I always assume multi-cloud is basically choosing the best services in each cloud and then combining them together. The problem is always how to connect all of them in a secure way and in a reliable way. And I think that is not going to get easier because there's not enough incentive to build a system to do that. But I would really want to have a multi-cloud breaker choose the most reliable managed Kubernetes and combine it with the most reliable database service, which may not be the same cloud provider, and just be able to choose the two without too much effort to get them all connected and worrying about the reliability of that.
Prashanta, what do you think? I mean, there is this troubling little thing called data, right? And moving that stuff around can be a little challenging. And if workloads are on the wrong side of the world, it gets even worse. So, do you think we can get there, or is it just never going to happen?
So definitely there is a strong desire. When you think about Google Anthos and stuff, we talk about migration of apps and stuff, but we talk about the application but not the real data, right? So definitely there are these trains of thoughts that are coming up. And then now you see a lot of storage vendors are also talking about asynchronous replication so that you can get data from one side to another side. to be able to move your application easily. Maybe you may have certain amount of downtime, like probably a couple of minutes and stuff, but people are kind of moving towards those patterns. We are in the data management, data migration, data protection business, and this becomes actually a uh, pretty solid use case, or is becoming a very, very solid use case for us, where we are trying to make sure that we can take away the data gravity problem across different hyperscalers or on-prem environments, so that you can start staging your data into different clouds. And then when you need to move your application, whether it is for cost requirements, performance requirements, or whether it's a disaster requirement, you can, basically your data is already there, and it's just a switch of the metadata pieces, and then you start running on the other side. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying it. There are 10 different things that need to happen in between, so it's not going to suit every kind of a workload. And yeah, in my opinion, we are trying to solve that problem. So I think it's not, it will happen, but it will be in a time basis, like in chunks and milestones, that we'll be able to achieve that.
All right. Andy, I think this may be our last question, but we'll see how much time we have. Should I have a dedicated Kubernetes team, or can I just, have my existing IT team kind of slide in there and start managing Kubernetes alongside everything else that they got to do?
That really depends on your IT team. If you've gone down the road of modernizing your DevOps practices, and you have some of that in place, it's likely that your IT team has the expertise to begin learning and operating Kubernetes, perhaps with a little bit of help from outside in the form of services. So, yeah, heavily dependent on your IT team. But I think it's entirely possible to build it with the team you have if you've made some initial steps.
All right. Wojciech, what do you think? Dedicated team, or can we make it more just part of our mainstream IT motions?
I think it can be part of the of regular IT team. As Andy said, there has to be talent externally or preferably in the company that knows Kubernetes, and also there should be the mindset. Like either DevOps practices should already be in place, and that's easiest because then it's a very similar mindset with Kubernetes, or there should be a mindset that's open to learning new technologies. I would say the only case I can think of where it would be risky to have the same team manage Kubernetes is if that team is thinking the traditional IT server management theme, and then whoever would be coming along and trying to change that would not be able to implement the new ways of thinking and the new ways of managing the Kubernetes part of the infrastructure. But as long as either there is enough talent to learn Kubernetes, or the talent that knows Kubernetes and can teach other parts of the IT team, I think it's always a better idea to manage using the same team, especially that a lot of things would overlap. So even if the team would not be using Kubernetes, there is a chance that they will be using public cloud, where they would have experience with databases, and a lot of applications would still need a lot of typical IT things like a database, some storage, and a lot of other things that would overlap with the IT team.
All right. Prashanto, we got a minute. What's your vote?
I would say it depends, because depends on a couple of things, right? Size of the organization. For example, if you are a smaller organization, then you probably won't invest additional resources in having a separate team. So that's one. And then second, depends upon the goals and the intentions, right? If you are going to be, if you have decided that Kubernetes is our next big thing, and we are going to completely centralize on everything Kubernetes, then yes, does it definitely make sense to have the existing IT team educated, enabled on managing that infrastructure. But if you're saying that, hey, you know what, I'm just going to have Kubernetes for these particular BUs and just run it in a silo over here, then maybe having a separate smaller team to manage that piece, while the overall IT team takes care of the bigger pieces. So
right.
that's how I look at it.
All right, awesome. Guys, let me shout out our winners for the Amazon gift cards. They are Joe W., Ivan O., Casimir R., Lyndall C. I want to thank our panelists for sharing their knowledge and their expertise. And my one bit of advice is The demand for Kubernetes expertise exceeds the supply, so learn Kubernetes and give yourself a raise. Hey guys, thanks for everything. Take care.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Mike. Thanks, everyone. Take care.